Loving God, you promise to be with your people always until the end of the age in your Son, Jesus. Sometimes we find him in places we expect, often in ways for which we were not looking. The Son of Man will come when you least expect, he tells us. So we ask you to keep us attentive to those moments when Jesus reveals himself present in our midst, the members of his Father. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. So I'm going to be over here a little bit because we do have we're recording it for posterity and for those who expressed an interest but can't join us. Just a little housekeeping. So, as I said, I am going to try very hard to be a better steward of our time, and then, by golly, we're going to get through some stuff. So we'll get through this kind of general overview of what are some of the ethical schools of thought and systems that people may have learned and bring to ethical conversations that maybe we're not always explicit about. And so sometimes there are conversations that kind of pass each other in the night because people are talking from different viewpoints or systems or theories that are important to them. And then we'll breeze through just highlights of the first three parts of the ethical and religious directives, and focus a little bit of attention on Directive 36. When I did this a number of years ago for the Diocese of Superior, Wisconsin, and it was a terrible few days for their clergy. I was their clergy conference. Of course, I was a newly minted PhD, so I knew absolutely everything about absolutely everything. And the farther you go, the less you know. It's really a very positive progression. But I did each section with, in the Middle Ages, they were known as questiones disputate, or disputed questions. They didn't have the internet or Snapchat or Instagram. So what they did for entertainment was have these public debates about disputed questions in theology. And many theologians, philosophers engaged in those. We have collections of them, and certainly for St. Thomas Aquinas, there's several of his collections of questiones disputate. So in ethics, necessarily, you often run into these disputed kinds of questions, where the church has a teaching, but it's not always universally welcome. And there are things, as we mentioned, like some of the gender medicine issues that there is currently in process, the development of a teaching, but we're not done yet. We're still learning about that and wrestling with the pieces of that. So that's another example of a disputed question. What to do for victims of sexual assault, women who have a concern about becoming pregnant because of that assault, is what Directive 36 is about. And it's one of those disputed questions. We're not necessarily going to resolve it here this evening. I can tell you what the church doctrine is, what the ERD tells us, and then we'll look at some of the different viewpoints that are out there, even in Catholic healthcare. Because some of it's a good illustration of the ways in which the moral theory and scientific fact, as far as we can know it in the moment, come into interact with one another. And it leaves us some room for certainty and some room for irresolvable doubt. And then the question is, how do you proceed in those circumstances? So that's a little housekeeping. Next week you have off because it's the Vigil of All Saints. We'll have masses, of course, and trunk or treat out here in the parking lot. And then we'll do 3 more weeks where we get through part 4, 5, and 6. They're a little more detailed. So part 4 is about issues at the beginning of life. artificial reproductive technologies, abortion, prenatal care, some of those issues. What happens in the NICU. The next week is probably the most, as I said, where we spend the most of our time in ethics consults, end-of-life decisions. Janet brought some of these books. You can take one of those along, read through that in preparation. And then part 6 is where I spend a fair amount of time in meetings around affiliations, mergers, sales, joint ventures, partnerships with Catholic and non-Catholic providers. And some of those complex issues around the principles governing cooperation. Okay, questions from last time? Anything that's kept you awake ever since? Price of gas, going grocery shopping. I did this at the school mess a few weeks ago. $20 bill, they all knew what that was. So when I was growing up, I'm old enough to tell those stories. This fed a family of 6 for a week. Now you go to Copeland's and you buy like 3 boxes of cereal. That's not enough. Gave them some perspective. So over time, we talked last time about what is ethics, reasoned deliberation about what is right or wrong in human actions. The idea of right or wrong, or the pursuit of what is good, naturally over time has evolved into many different viewpoints or theories about how do you decide what is right, what is wrong, where are those boundaries and limits, what is permissible, what is always off limits. What is good? So some of you have extensive education, perhaps more so than I do about this, but bear with me. So I'm going to just skim through some of the more prominent ethical theories that emerge from philosophy and theology in our tradition. I'm not going to talk, except just at the very end, a little bit about some of those non-Western, non-Christian ethical systems that we sometimes encounter as well. So going back to Plato and some of his contemporaries in 4th century BC Greece, the idea of virtue. What is good is to live a virtuous life. The pursuit of perfection or excellence, arete in Greek. What is virtue? Virtue is what a virtuous person does. What does a virtuous person do? A virtuous person lives in virtue. What's the goal of virtue? To be virtuous. It gets a little circular. Plato, of course, had this idea of the world of forms or ideas, that there were archetypes, if you will, or perfect examples of every being. There is the ideal chair, the ideal table. And the things that we experience in the sense world, or the human world, even of reason, are examples of that are always imperfect, expressions of the perfect idea, the world of forms, or the world of ideas. And it sounds abstract, it is abstract. Virtue, then, there was an ideal state of justice, prudence, courage, honesty, beauty, all these ideals that we approximate to or try and grow closer to. But we would never really achieve them until we die. Then you leave behind the prison, this is Plato's view, the prison of the body and this material world, and enter the world of forms with your soul, whatever that is. He wasn't really clear about that. Aristotle wasn't quite either. But there's the idea that there is some ideal perfect world that we see only by dim reflection or by shadows. If you really want a taste of this, read book 6 of his book, The Republic. It's the famous allegory of the cave, where he tries to express what the philosopher's life and purpose is. So you have these prisoners who are chained in a dark cave. And they're chained in such a way that they can't turn their heads, they can only face this blank wall. Behind them is a fire and kind of an archway. And slaves walk by carrying something like a jar or a tree branch or a lamp. And they would only see projected the shadow of that object on the back wall. That is Plato's view of how our intellect is limited. We don't see the things as they are, we see only reflections or shadows of them. And then he says, suppose one of those prisoners were let free and taken out into the world of light and see things in 3 dimensions, see colors, see the sky, see the whole world of nature firsthand. And then we're brought back down into the cave and try to convince the other prisoners what is really out there, what the world is really like. And he said that's the role of the philosopher, where you try and present this vision that most people don't have access to, and often you're just rejected. So the world of ideas. The habits, virtues are habits. They're stable dispositions to act in a certain way. Virtue doesn't necessarily make you always act in a virtual way, but it's more likely that you will. And the opposite of virtue is vice. Also bad habits, or things that are habits that lead us to non-virtuous actions. It's no guarantee that you'll always act in a vicious or vice-filled way, but it's just more likely. The kind of inertia that is part of human behavior. So these are repeated actions that build virtue. The more often you act honestly, justly, fairly, the better you are at creating art or beauty or finding mathematical truth, the more likely you are to do so regularly. And one of Plato's and Aristotle's statement was, so prudence is the virtue of knowing what is right to do, right reason about things to be done. The virtue of prudence is analogous to the virtue of art, which is right reason about things to be made. So there's proportion, beauty, elegance that we see in works of art. He would say it's the same with a virtuous life. There's a kind of a beauty and a proportion and an elegance about a virtuous life. Prudence is the virtue that is most necessary in ethics. Right reason about things to be done. Because as we said, ethics is a practical science. It's not merely abstract or the world of ideas. It's geared towards decisions and actions. So, as I note here, virtue can vary across times and places and culture. You've certainly seen the evolution of some of that in our own American culture. Things that used to seem upstanding and upright now might seem as quaint or old-fashioned or out of touch. And things that used to be viewed with some disdain or mistrust now often become things that are admired, to be sort of outspoken and assertive and maybe even crass and insulting. That now has become more of a social virtue than a vice in some people's minds. So this can shift over time. In practical matters, Plato would say that's the problem with the culture, not the problem with virtue. So he was looking for something stable, okay, that would transcend particular place or time or cultures or customs that a particular city-state might adopt. What is valued as good can change over time. A second set of ideas around what is ethical is duty. Technical terms from the Greek deontos, it's called deontology, and one of the most familiar proponents of this was Immanuel Kant, a German philosopher, who said, with the categorical imperative, as he called it, what is right is to fulfill your duty, to do what you must do, to act in such a way that your actions could be universalized, that what I did, everybody should do, and it would be the best possible world. To fulfill one's duties to self and to others. Immanuel Kant was an interesting guy. The story is often told, he lived in Königsberg, and he would have what became known as the philosopher's walk. Every day, he would make the same exact path through the bridges of Königsberg, and people knew they could set their clock by the, if Kant is going by, it must be 5 after 1. He was a very rigid kind of thinker, and that kind of trapped him at times. Because the question about duty, obviously, is, of course, and this is something you see in professional codes of ethics. This is what you must do. In the military, as a nurse, as a physician, in law enforcement, you have certain duties that you must fulfill. But why? Who decides what those duties are? Why are those duties good? And we know from history that at times people can feel a duty towards something or a leader that in fact is immoral. But I must do this because I have been commanded to do so. And this is some of the tension that arises between a sense of an individual's conscience and what they're told their duty is. Okay? Third theory, communitarian ethics. This is a little bit more contemporary in its expression, although it goes back a long, long time in different cultures and communities. The consensus of the community determines what is right or wrong. Take, for instance, in our country, and in many places around the world, same-sex marriage. It is now the law of the land. If you would have asked your grandparents, would there ever be such a thing? I'm pretty sure they would have just looked at you funny, like, who could ever imagine something like that? Communitarian ethics takes into account the consensus of the community. What do most people think? We have some sense of this with even our system of government. It's representational. You elect people that you believe will advance your perspectives. And we've known in history over time this changes, what the priorities or outlook or the kind of moral direction of a society or culture can take depending on who the leadership is. There was a philosopher called H. Christian Engelhardt. He wrote a long book. And his theory of this is what he called general secular morality. And Engelhardt was often misunderstood because he was simply reporting on what he observed. He was not advocating for this, but said this is the way our culture tends to function, based on permission. You can do whatever you want in your private life, and nobody much cares, Engelhardt observes. But when your personal preferences come in conflict with someone else's personal preferences, then you need some traffic laws. And we don't do well in a pluralistic society with having a common moral vision for that, but we have some procedures for it. So your assertion of your rights cannot conflict with my rights. You don't get to decide for me. If it doesn't affect other people, you can do whatever you want, but as soon as it costs other people money or their own freedom, then we have to find some way to navigate this. General secular morality. And he used the word secular there to say, this isn't based on a religious tradition or a particular transcendent moral viewpoint. It's just what we come to work out together. And you can see then that what is right can vary with particular communities and times. And you try and find kind of the least common denominator. How can we all function together, even though we might be very much at odds about our fundamental moral commitments? And then it also raises the question, if you're talking about communitarian ethics, who's in the community and who's out of the community? Who has a voice and who doesn't have a voice? We live these kinds of tensions every day. Libertarian ethics. A number of thinkers can be associated with this, but it's also pretty common in American culture, at least North American culture, US culture, let me put it that way. The goal is to maximize individual freedom and freedom of choice, connected with general secular morality here. But even more specifically, your ideal is that everybody can pursue whatever they want as much as possible. That's your goal, to maximize individual choice. It might be conditioned, as we say, by impact on other people's choices, but the goal is this maximum liberty. So you see this perhaps often in the world of economics, or our sort of entrepreneurial system. Everybody has a chance to make their fortune in whatever way they want, as long as it's legal. This is where did Google and Apple come from? I found a niche to exploit that I created a need that nobody even realized they had. And as long as people are freely choosing this, nobody makes you buy an iPhone, although you might feel the pressure from your kids. It's fine. So libertarianism. Theological ethics. So we certainly know the Judeo-Christian Western moral foundations. And come back to this over and over again, certainly in Catholic healthcare ethics. I believe the most fundamental and world-changing teaching Jesus has is that idea that whatever you do for the least, you do for me. That there's a radical equality for all people based on their being children of God, created and loved by God, and called to eternal life. And that we have a moral responsibility for one another. Not merely how I live my own life, but the impact that I have on others, and not merely to minimize harm to them, but I am trusted with the gospel to maximize good for others. So God reveals what is right. Commandments, sacred writings. We have the Old and New Testament, the sacred scriptures. Other cultures have the Quran, the Bhagavad Gita, Buddhist writings, writings of Confucius, Zen. There's all kinds of different sacred writings that people can refer to. Sometimes it's inspiration, sometimes it's prophecy. You think of the Latter-day Saints and Joseph Smith and the Golden Tablets. So there's some kind of idea that this transcendent moral truth has come down to us from a higher power, and that this is where we find truth. And of course, what happens with theological ethics, it varies with different religious traditions, how much they are proponents of that, and the interpretation of it. There's Catholics and Catholics and Catholics and Catholics. We all have the same magisterium, the same scriptures, but we can have very different viewpoints on the implications, what it means we're supposed to be doing based on those scriptures. So just a word, we had a case not too long ago, I think I briefly mentioned last time, with a patient who was Somali, an elderly patient, and his family. And we ran across a case early on, maybe 10 years ago or so, with a young person who was critically brain injured and in the ICU. And we realized that we don't have a real clear understanding of what Islamic ethics teaches. And so we had to do a little research as an ethics committee, and some, of course, really went, as much in depth than the rest of us. But kind of what we concluded from that it's very tentative. That whereas the Catholic faith has a magisterium, so we have a central authority. The Pope, united with the bishops, interprets authentically what moral truth is, what the natural law requires. Divine and human law interact there, but we have a centralized teaching. Not everybody agrees with it, not everybody follows it, but at least everybody can say what the official line is. Islamic ethics is not like that. It's more like Judaism, where you have different schools of thought, different rabbis, different imams, different interpretations of it. The Sunnis and the Shiites are in the news all the time. They differ not only on military and political goals, but on some of these interpretations of the Quran as well. So what is stronger in Islamic ethics than Christian ethics is the idea of authority. And so you see this reflected, and we sometimes encounter this in these consults. Who gets to have a voice? Who speaks for? It's often the elder of the family who will speak for members of the family. Not so much the individual, where we emphasize autonomy. What do you want? You can ask for counsel and advice, but ultimately we defer to the free and competent choice of the person with capacity. Even if their family disagrees, even if the doctor disagrees, even if the pastor disagrees, they have that right to self-determination. That's very different, at least as we understand it, in common interpretation of Islamic thinking about these matters. Now that's an outsider's view. I'm sure it's much more complex than that. But we had to find some way to understand so that we could proceed in a meaningful way to have a conversation across some of these boundaries. It's easy for us to presume that everybody kind of thinks like we do. We don't even know. It's not like we can identify how we differ. We don't even know too much about this. So it's a constant state of learning. Utilitarianism, often associated with John Stuart Mill, Jeremy Bentham, 18th and 19th century. And utilitarianism is often viewed as might makes right, or the greatest good for the greatest number, with the idea that it's always about majority rule. Those who have the loudest voice and the greatest numbers get to decide what is right. Sometimes that happens, but that's not really utilitarianism. Utilitarianism actually was a theory that says whatever decisions are made, they must benefit everyone to the greatest extent possible. This was a way, as industrial society grew and the worker class was being exploited, almost like slaves, that they have a voice, that their rights are important and be protected. This is where the idea of unions came out. Guilds from the Middle Ages, but unions in the more contemporary industrial age sense. So to read this not just as the majority is right, but the majority must make sure that everyone is cared for to the extent that is possible. That's what we really mean by utilitarianism. There will still be people that are marginalized. And so while we're looking for the greatest good for the greatest number, we always, in Catholic thought, also have to be attentive to those that are in that other portion, even if it's a small portion of humanity that shares the same human dignity as the majority. Rights theory. This is probably one of the most prominent operative theories that we encounter over and over again. It is my right. I have the right to choose, I have the right to vote, I have the right to a just wage, I have the right to marry whoever I want, I have the right to health care, I have the right to education. There's all kinds of these claims about rights. One of the problems is a lack at times of making the distinction between objective rights, what are inherent to the human person, and subjective rights, what I claim for myself, that may or may not coincide. We do have rights. I've often thought, so a lot of the contemporary emphasis on rights came out of the last century. The Nuremberg trials, some of the Nazi experiments on human subjects, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights came out of the Nuremberg trials after the Second World War. And the church upheld the idea, obviously, of this Universal Declaration of Human Rights. But rights has never really been a strong part of Catholic teaching in the tradition. If you read Aquinas, there's one question that uses the term rights out of the whole Summa Theologiae. His emphasis is on the good. How do we pursue the good? What are the requirements of the good? Where do we find the good? How do we cooperate with the good? And so I often think rights have a place, absolutely. They become kind of a common language that we can share and talk about what we mean by our moral commitments, but they're sometimes really get confused between what is objective rights that we would insist upon from the Catholic viewpoint and subjective rights that we might disagree with. So, what is right in rights theory is what is determined by respecting each person's rights to social goods, to personal freedom, to dignity, to education, to healthcare, to a just wage. All of those things we can certainly, and do certainly support in our tradition. But balancing those two, where do rights come from? Does it come from law or court decisions? Does it come from the voters? Does it come from the scriptures? Does it come from my parents? Where do rights originate? And what are there common human rights that regardless of who you are, where you are, what state or condition you're in, what your socioeconomic status is, what your education is, what your race or ethnicity is, that you have the same rights as everybody else. These are easy to talk about. They're hard at times to bring into public life consistently. And this is where all these court cases come from. I don't know what the ratio is now, but I remember looking this up maybe 20 years ago. At that point, there was one attorney for every 300 men, women, and children in the United States. They all need work. So we have an enormous amount of adjudication and litigation in our culture that has to do with conflicting rights and claims. I went with the person who purchased the rectory at St. Anthony's. Roxanne Storms and Roxanne. Well, so as the pastor, I was technically the owner and at that point, and had to go along for the signing. You've been to these. The stack of paper that high. And every single sheet of paper was some court case, where there was some dispute about, got to make sure this is clear in law. And you just sign. I didn't have to sign much. She spent an hour and a half signing documents. Comes from this litigious society in which we live. Law. Law is intended to, according to Aquinas, lead a community to justice. And his view was that if you had a truly just community, you would not need law. Because people would naturally do these things about which law is. You wouldn't need to enforce it, you wouldn't need to enunciate it, you wouldn't need all of this apparatus because people would act in a just or good way. But Aquinas had a clear understanding of original sin. We don't always act in ways that we ought. And so we need law as the basis for right conduct. But law, as it's practiced often in human society, is what the law permits, requires, or determines what is right. And we know Roe versus Wade is a classic example of something that is so fundamental that law changes. Truth of what law is about doesn't change, but the interpretation, the enforcement, the emphasis on these things can change. I'm not an attorney, although several attorneys have told me I sometimes think like an attorney. And they always say, that's not meant as an insult. So law can be a form of communitarian ethics. This is what the community has decided is permitted or prohibited. And it comes from a variety of sources. It can come from all of those other forms of ethical theory. It might be from cultural norms. It might be from precedent. It might be from religious traditions that are enshrined in a society's law. Certainly, there are streams of that in Islam where the law, religion and law are sort of interchangeable. The society's law is the religious law. Majority rule, there's a number of ways in which law can be the kind of moral compass for a secular society. Laws at times conflict with one another or with the community's consensus. And one of the principles generally about law is that law should be enforceable. There has to be some mechanism by which law can be advanced or protected, otherwise it just becomes... You don't want laws that you can't enforce or that are so vague or broad that they generate contempt for the law. So law doesn't matter. Everybody does what they want anyway, nothing happens. So this is part of any good policy or law, that there's some consequences. Parents do this all the time with your kids. You make all kinds of rules, but if you never enforce them, kids go pretty quick. You don't really do it. And it's one of the hardest things. I'm not a parent, but I've certainly seen parents struggle with this, to follow through. Because they love their children. They don't want to harm them in any way, or even be perceived being harmed. But sometimes not enforcing those rules leads to concern of greater harm in the future. So that's a difficult balance. It's true in society as well. This is just a really brief overview. There are other theories and sub-theories of this, but just to give you a flavor. What does the church rely on? Fundamentally, that's why we do it. Come on in.
Have you started?
Huh?
Oh, sorry.
I said that's why we're doing all this for them. What does the church rely on? It's a combination really of all of these, but we find the best elements in them, in our view, in natural law. Natural law for the church is what is required for each thing, each nature, to come to perfection, to be most completely what God intends it to be. So, one of the errors about natural law is the idea that it's just the laws of nature, like gravity or the seasons or the motions of the planets, that Catholic teaching simply looks at the way stuff is and says that must be the way it's supposed to be. Natural law differs from that, and particularly when it comes to the human person, because part of human nature is freedom. Aquinas talks about this. For a rock always falls, fire always burns, and the heat goes up. Those are laws of nature. What the human has, there is no one single path to fulfillment. There are a variety of paths to fulfillment because we are free. There are guideposts, there are boundaries to that, there are things we cannot do because they are contrary to the perfection of our own being, our own nature. So he would say, for instance, suicide. The most fundamental desire of anything in being is to stay in being. We recognize that when people have suicidal ideation or even are successfully complete suicide, we believe that they are not acting rationally, that there is depression, there's some psychological burden that they experience. They don't really want to die as an end. They simply don't want to continue to live this way. And so this becomes our responsibility to help them, support them, find ways to give them the help that they need. So we'll come back to this when we talk about assisted suicide. Should that be legal in any municipality or place where you say, you know, you're right, your life is really unbearable, and I think you should just go. Is that the Christian response? The church would say. So. What each created nature needs for integral flourishing. So for human persons, human nature is this complex of body and soul. We are a composite of spirit and matter. And for human flourishing, all of those parts of the person have to be attended to. Body, mind, will, spirit. Our physical health and needs, our intellectual, our desire to know the truth and live in accordance with the truth, our will, our freedom, and our relationships with others, and then our spiritual life, our relationship with God. So in an appropriate balance, all of those things have to be attended to. Natural law, Catholic healthcare tries to attend to all of that. So spiritual care, from a Catholic ethical point of view, is an essential part of caring for the person. It's not just surgery, medication, turning people, making sure they're properly fed and toileted. That's important. It's part of care for the person. But that kind of merely physical intervention is not yet Catholic healthcare. We want excellence, we want to do that well, we want to do it competently, we want good quality outcomes and good patient experience, all of that. But we also want to attend to their questions. Why is this happening? Why is this happening to me or my loved one? Tell me about my situation, my condition, what are my alternatives, what are my choices, what will happen to me if I do this or that or the other thing. What about the people I love and care for? Who's going to take care of them? I don't know how to talk to my friend who has cancer because I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing. Why is this happening? Is God punishing me? All of those parts of a person's experience of illness and sickness and dependency is a part of natural law for us to follow in Catholic health. Does that make sense? We live in a pluralistic society, of course, so it's easy for me to stand up here and talk about these moral visions. We don't all have the same understanding of this. If you're in healthcare, any kind of public life, ministry, politics, education, wherever you go, business, there's a range of ethical perspectives. Sometimes our own views are a little fuzzy, and they can evolve and change over time, certainly so in interacting with other people as well. So we will have these tensions. There's a book, two books actually, by a British philosopher, Alistair MacIntyre. The first one was called After Virtue. Again, he's talking about reclaiming the idea of the Greek theory of virtue, Plato and Aristotle, and building a moral system around the pursuit of excellence in human living. And he starts out the book with a really nice image, I think, from archaeology. You come across this archaeological dig and you find pillars and artifacts and pieces of stone and wall, and you can sort of picture together, put together in your mind or build a model of what that looked like. But you know you're missing some pieces and you're guessing about a lot of things. We do this sometimes with ancient languages as well. We try and find our way, but we've got a lot of gaps. So this is the Western experience of the inheritance of Greek culture, Greek morality, that we have little bits and pieces of it. People will talk with great zeal about justice, but they don't understand justice the way Plato and Aristotle would have in this holistic picture. For many people speaking of justice, it might simply mean it is society's responsibility to give me what I desire. That would be justice. Justice is much more complicated. Distributive justice, retributive justice, commutative justice. Yes, I must pay my taxes if I'm going to drive on those roads. I have an obligation, not merely as a recipient, but as a participant. That is justice. And then that's his second book, Who is Justice, Which Rationality? So people will use this language about freedom and liberty and justice and prudence and goodness, but we often mean very different things about it. And MacIntyre is simply pointing that out and outlining some of those conflicts that we run into, even though we seem to be talking with the same words, but with different ideas behind it. Said this earlier, but I think it's really true. So leave all that theory behind and say, where do I get my moral ideas? And they evolve, they change over time, but they often come for all of us from different pieces, bits and pieces. What did I learn growing up? What were our family traditions, customs, values, non-negotiables? What was viewed as right or good the way I grew up? My dad, for instance, and my mom too, but my dad especially, hard work, frugality. And we often, you know, some kids would always say, how come they got that and we don't? And my dad would always say, you don't need that. His way of saying, that's not what life is really about. You can find meaning and happiness. Of course, my mom would say, if you ever say, I'm bored, well, I'll find something for you to do if you can't find something for yourself. So then you suddenly weren't bored anymore because you never knew what she might have in mind, cleaning this or fixing that. Educational experiences. Where I'm in school, what kinds of rules we had in school, what we were taught about what is right and good and how we behave and interact. As well as more advanced kind of education, ideas that come into our minds that appeal to us. They all have some aspect of truth or they wouldn't have gotten that far, but we have to kind of piece together where all that fits. Religious tradition, beliefs, if we have tradition that we follow. Personal life experiences, sometimes positive. I really enjoyed doing this or that for someone else. Often enough negative. I never want that to happen again. Either something I've done or something that's happened to me by others. This shapes and forms our moral viewpoints. Cultural influences. What's trending on TikTok? That forms a lot of people's people's viewpoints of what is right and good and healthy and important and valued. Professional standards. If I belong to a profession, education, healthcare, politics, business, that there are certain standards that are expected, military, and that's how I am to conduct myself. But above all, I think we're influenced by the people we trust. You have a question, you're not sure about something, who do you go to? What we found, of course, contemporary research into young people going gone. Where do they go first, Joe? Do they have questions?
Well, to their friends.
Their friends, or their virtual friends. I Google. I vividly remember this experience. I'm out in the garage at Holy Spirit, and I'm working on somebody's car. I don't remember who. This young man belonged to the parish. He was, I think, at that time 14 or 15. And he had some developmental disabilities, cognitive. And he rode his bike up, and he was really distraught because his girlfriend of a couple of months put on Facebook that she was pregnant and that he was the father. And he had this, all this scenario, what's going to happen to me? I'm going to pay child support, and I'm not ready to be a father, and slow down. Do you know this is really true? Do you know even she's pregnant? Much less. Well, come to find out that he had never been intimate with her. So, but he didn't understand at that cognitive level. It was like, but he was just in this panic. This is how I would find out that I'm allegedly a father, by happening to see somebody's Facebook. So you can all tell stories. So our culture has changed. Who do we trust? Who has influence on us? And sometimes I think in many areas it's not so much who I trust most, but who I distrust least. Who do I think is not really out to get me? So often our thinking is kind of backwards or negative rather than positive. What is the key ethical skill? Dialogue. To listen, to understand, to seek to understand, ask questions so you understand, to be respectful rather than belittling, to dismissive of the person's point of view, even if we strongly disagree with it. We had a good opportunity for that with the Synod. That's what that was all about. Not just listening to each other, but listening to the Holy Spirit, but being able to listen to people's perspectives that might be very different than mine. Doesn't necessarily mean we're all just kind of moving toward a big mishmash of feel-good feelings, but I cannot engage in meaningful dialogue with you if I don't understand what you're saying. I can't answer your questions or refute certain beliefs that I think you're mistaken about unless I understand what you're actually doing. So ethics consults are painful for me at times. Sometimes they're highly fraught with emotion. Sometimes it's hard to watch people who are not listening to each other, just shouting, or it's clear that that last 10 minutes you were thinking about what you were going to say rather than what the explanation that was given. And sometimes we just find there's this intractable conflict of viewpoints. And we keep coming back then, we're not going to resolve family dynamics that go back 30 and 40 years in this next half hour around a very difficult decision for your loved one. We need to return the focus to what are we going to do for this person in terms of their goal. Doesn't mean those other things aren't important, but that's not, we can't let them derail the goal that we're trying to achieve. So respectful, open dialogue.
Do you have the PowerPoint sheet for today?
Didn't I have those up?
Well, I think I
No, I don't think I have it. I thought I had it in the stack, but I don't think I printed them off. Sorry, Joe.
I apologize, I just,
No, I will do that. I thought I had them.
you know, I thought Jerry Wager looked like he had something important that I didn't say.
If you're involved in healthcare ethics, you'll very soon, even casual reading, come across the core principles. This has become, in that literature and in that world, probably the most influential moral compass or lens that things are viewed through. Not natural law, not libertarian ethics, not communitarian ethics, not legal things. Those all have a part, but it's the principles. The principles are not answers. They're sort of like touch points. These are the things we need to be sure we attend to in a balanced way. General concepts or ideals that are applied for prudential decision making. So they're frameworks rather than answers. And they come from these two guys. Well, they're popularized by these two guys. Tom Beecham, James Childress. They're both philosophers, both still living. Their first edition of Principles of Biomedical Ethics became a classic textbook, came out in 1979. I think they're still on the 7th edition, although there might be an 8th by now. And this came from the Belmont Report. 1978, and there is still such a federal agency. It's changed names over time. It is the President's Council for Biomedical Questions. Had a much longer name. National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects in Biomedical and Behavioral Research. And this was largely around the Tuskegee syphilis study, 40-year study of black men who had contracted syphilis. And there was an effective medication to treat syphilis that came out fairly early on in that study, but they didn't use it on all of the subjects. They continued this study to see what the natural course of syphilis would be over time without informed consent by these black men. And so many of them suffered and even died of syphilis, even though there was a readily available treatment. This became scandalous, rightly so. And so as a part of the result of this, when this came out in '72, was this focus on human research. It was from this era that institutional review boards for any kind of research in medicine that involves human subjects, there has to be this institutional process to make sure that the rights and the freedom of human subjects are respected in any research. In the background, of course, too, is some of the Nazi experimentation in the Second World War. So we had a 4-day session at this retreat center, this little conference center, which is pictured there, in Maryland. Belmont Conference Center. It became known as the Belmont Report. And they came up with 3 principles as a common ground basis for ethical research. And it became expanded then beyond that mere question of research into any kind of interaction, any kind of medical interventions, any kind of provision of health care. So originally there were 3 principles: respect for persons, justice, and beneficence. They were sort of refined and became, for a long time, the 4 principles: autonomy, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. Later on, to specify more completely again, they added veracity, or telling the truth. It's part of autonomy with informed consent, but they found it sufficiently distinct that they added a 5th principle. So autonomy is about the patient's right to self-determination. I get to decide what happens to my own body. Sounds nice until you get into more recently, as we have had some of these, the growth in dementia and Alzheimer's disease, and forms of the lack of capacity, where people are unreliable decision makers for themselves, who then speaks authoritatively in the best interest of that person. There's all kinds of court cases in the 70s and into the 80s around this question. This is where the idea of advance directives came from, that there should be a mechanism in law for people to say what they desire ahead of time, so that we don't guess about what they would have really desired for their own health care. It's an extension of the patient's autonomy, self-determination. But you know that autonomy can come into conflict with other people's desires and rights. And so autonomy is not an absolute. I have kidney disease, I want my brother's kidney. I claim my brother's kidney. That's my decision, that's my self-determination. Well, your brother might have something to say about that as well. I'm not going to give you my kidney. So autonomy is conditioned by other goods. Non-maleficence comes from the Hippocratic Oath, primum non nocere, first do no harm. That whatever intervention we want to make, we want to do it in such a way that will not cause further harm. What does harm mean? Is it pain? Is it financial cost? Is it the emotional burden of care, like for a person who's Seventh-day Adventist, or Jehovah's Witness, excuse me, and would not accept a blood transfusion? So harm can take different forms. What does it mean not to do harm? And some of the things that we can do to extend life may, for a particular patient, actually add to their suffering or cause further harm. All things considered. Beneficence, kind of the positive side to non-maleficence. We want simply not to avoid doing harm, we want to do what is good for the person. Either to give them comfort, to increase their quality of life, to extend their life, to give them cure or a return to function, or at least better function than they had. Our goal is to do good for the patient. From a Catholic perspective, overall good. Not merely physical or biophysical progress. Justice. As I mentioned, justice means a variety of things. The most simple classic definition is to give another what is due. So education, health care, protection, the right to life, all of those things are part of justice. But justice also is what society owes the individual, what the individual owes society, and what individuals within society owe each other. All of those are different aspects of justice. Where this often comes into play is in two ways in our consults. Number one, justice would say, we would do for your loved one what we would do for anyone else in their circumstances. So we're not taking into account their financial status, their social background, their education, their religious tradition. Justice would say, we are looking at this person as a person, aside from all of those accidental factors. Some of them may be relevant in terms of their prognosis and their likelihood, the susceptibility to certain conditions or illnesses. But that's the only way in which we would consider those things. And the second aspect of justice is related to the idea of limited resources. Healthcare is expensive. Certain interventions are highly expensive. Some of the cancer drugs that you can get are $100,000 or more a dose, because they are very rare conditions and rare medications for which there is no market. And increasingly, as you all know, one of our scarce resources right now is people. We have beds, we have ventilators, we have equipment, but we don't have nurses or other providers who can care for people. So many nursing homes have many more beds in closed units because they just can't staff them. So that ties in with some questions about justice as well. And veracity is about informed consent, telling the truth, and after several of our recent consults, I think we need another aspect of veracity is truth accepting. Because sometimes we've run into people who absolutely refuse, and I mean in an intentional way, to accept imaging, results of exploratory surgery, the brain scans, all of these things that are clear medical indicators. I don't believe it. I don't believe it. He's talking to me when you're not in the room. This is simply not possible. This person is in a persistent vegetative state. No one else has seen this. Clearly you are projecting your desire for what you would want for them. But it's just not medically, neurologically even possible. And so we've had some really, really difficult conversations that have resulted in a little litigation and threats and little bodily harm. Well, not grave bodily harm, but there have been staff that have been accosted and frustrated families. So, the principles. The main thing I want you to know about the principles is that we often use them in our deliberations as guideposts, but we often have to play them off against each other. Autonomy, what the person desires, may come in conflict with non-maleficence, or beneficence, or justice. So you have to hold those things in tension. And that takes practice, and time, and deliberation. And I often find myself going back. What is my sort of compass? What do the ethical religious directives say, and what do they mean? What is hospital policy? What is legal? What do we learn from past cases and experiences like this? What are the medical professionals who have experience and expertise saying? All of those things come into play. What is really in the best interest of this person, holistically considered, including the idea that they have an eternal destiny. In other words, death, accepting the limitations of medicine, I'll come back to this in a couple of weeks, is not a failure. It's not saying we didn't do the right thing. Sometimes it is saying we will now shift our goals from cure to care, palliative care, hospice, to give them the best experience in their family, the best experience of the inevitable decline and departure from this life. Mortality is 100%. Everybody will die of something. We want to do what we can to make that reality as pain-free, as symptom-free, as human as we can. Not to abandon if we change course. So part one, if you go back to the introduction, 5 points that they emphasize that I would just like to recap here. What is Catholic healthcare about? To promote and defend human dignity and life. Again, that holistic view of the human person. Second, the option for the poor. Whatever you do for the least, you do for me. Contribute to the common good. What is the common good? These are social structures that allow each person in each society to flourish, become fully the best arrangement so that individuals can meet their human dignity and the society as a whole functions well. Have we ever reached it? Well, approximately. There are parts where we're better and parts where we still have room to grow. Catholic healthcare is about stewardship. We are given gifts from God, resources, education, the material things that we have, the buildings, the people that we work with, people that we serve, and we are called to be stewards, to use those gifts in accord with God's will to benefit others. And Catholic healthcare has moral commitments. There are limits to what we will do. We will not perform direct abortions, we will not perform direct sterilizations, we will not participate in assisted suicide or euthanasia. But again, the things that we won't do are always consequences of positives. We're not a negative outlook. It's because there are these higher values, goods that are at stake, that certain things do not accord with that true value or that true good. The dignity, the worth, the infinite worth of every human person. And this causes us some conflicts at times where we will refuse to do certain procedures. And you run in this, we'll come back to this with the rape protocols. You come into conflict at times with law, positive law, which says you must, you will. We say we can't, you must, you can't. And we'll see how that gets navigated, practically speaking. When we talk about moral decision-making in the Catholic tradition, we come back to what is commonly known as the three fonts of morality. The action itself, what am I doing? The intention, why am I doing this particular action? What am I trying to accomplish? What is my motivation, motive, and circumstances that can condition the action? Who is acting? So if a nurse comes in and turns off the IV pump, that's very different than a family member who said, I can't stand that beeping, and just turns it off. Who is acting can have an impact on the morality of an action. How? What actually is being done to achieve the person's goal? Where is it taking place? An example of where matter back. I got too many possibilities going through my head. Why is the circumstantial intention? So take the case of a woman, a younger woman who is pregnant and is fearful and is contemplating abortion. The circumstantial intention might be, my parents will be upset with me, they will throw me out, they will beat me, they will abuse me. I want to complete my education, I can't afford this. There's all kinds of thoughts that go swirling around when people face a difficult personal decision. Those are circumstantial intentions. This is not the actual intention that is the moral object. My intention of going to the abortion clinic is not really, all those things are in the background, but the reason I go here rather than the Crisis Pregnancy Center is because I desire to have an abortion. That is my goal, my intention for this particular act. Does that make sense? When it happens, in what way, and about what. So these are kind of the classic Aristotelian circumstances. The formal object, you remember I talked about proportionalism, that maybe in certain circumstances we can, it wouldn't be murder in this case because murder is wrong, killing is wrong, but maybe in this situation it wouldn't really be murder. It would be merely getting rid of a person who has done me harm. I'm just acting in justice, but I'm bypassing law enforcement and the courts. They would kill him too if they had a choice. I'm just doing it myself. The formal object is not merely what I do, but it is also the direct intention that I have in choosing this particular action. So circumstantial intentions, even if they have a good end in mind, don't justify things that are intrinsically wrong. Slavery is an inherent wrong. No matter what my intentions about providing this person a place to live rather than living on the streets, no matter what I say about, as soon as we make enough money, then I will set them free and I'll pay them for their back pay. Doesn't matter. It's inherently wrong to enslave another person. That's easy to think about sometimes with our own national history, but with human trafficking, this continues in our own day, where people are trapped and forced to act in certain ways, and that's always wrong, no matter what a person's motivation for doing it might be. When we think about making a moral decision, then I came up with this iPod. It's easy for me to remember at least. What are the factors you have to think through to find the object, the action itself, the direct intention, and the circumstances? iPod. Give me all the information. What are the medical facts? Think of an ethical medical decision. What are the medical facts? What's the history, the prognosis, the diagnosis, what have we tried, what has worked, what has not worked in the past, what medications are in use, what are the side effects, what are the risks, what are the benefits, what are their family system, do we have an idea of what they themselves desire through an advance directive or some other statement they've made? We want to gather as much information from as many people as we can, have the clearest possible picture. What are the problems? What are the ethical problems? What is the real conflict here? Is it about extension of life that would have some risks, and maybe their advance directive that says they want everything possible done? What is the ethical conflict? And sometimes you have family who insists on one thing and the patient's advance directive leads in another direction. Or you have family members that come in conflict. Usually, I don't know, all these people live in California, but they always fly in from California and say, you can't do that. We have to do this for mom instead. And we run into these conflicts. Sometimes it's providers that are at odds with each other. Sometimes it's provider and family that are at odds with each other. But we have to identify what those conflicts, what are we trying to do? What problem exists that we are trying to solve? Because it keeps the discussion then about the issue and not about persons. Not about you always said this, and mom liked you best, and I don't trust doctors, and my uncle they operated on the wrong knee, and all that stuff that's not really relevant to what we're trying to do for this person here. What are the options? What could we do? What are the likelihoods? What are the risks and benefits of each of those? What is the likelihood of outcome? You can always do it by percentages, probabilities, those kinds of things. And one of the options is to do nothing, to see what happens. Expectant management, we'll just kind of watch this, or we'll try a intervention or a therapy for a short time, a week, 2 days, we'll see how they do, if they improve or if it makes no difference. What are all of our options? And then you have to make a decision. As I said a couple times, ethics is inherently practical. So we have to make a decision and then evaluate that decision. What did we learn from this? Did we make the right decision? Did it help? How can we do better in the future when we face cases like this? We're trying to put together an archive of all of the consults that we've had over 10, 20 years, because people keep changing on that ethics committee, and you have different people who don't all have the same background or experience or cases. So it's good to have some common place where we can look, say, what did we decide then, and on what basis can we learn from the past? So I mentioned all of those things, information that we need, together that what are the problems, who should be at the table, who are we not hearing from. We had some interesting experiences. Forged advance directives, for instance, where it became clear this is not this person's wishes, it's child or spouse's wishes that they just signed. And we had one case, I vividly remember this, where the family insisted that this patient had no quality of life, was near the end of his life because of dementia, but miraculously, the night before, he had this moment of lucidity where he signed this advance directive and gave all of the decision-making to me. Doesn't compute. That was a difficult morning. And it's a good place to stop. This far, sorry. I like this Calvin Hobbes, when we're sure that our decisions are the best ones possible, and that God sends you. So very often we wrestle with decisions, and the person sort of recovers on their own. Or probably what happens more often is while we're still wrestling with decision, the person will expire. And that becomes sort of a moot point, what we're going to do. We can still learn from the experience, the conversations that we had, the process that we followed. How can we do this better? We'll come back to this, I promise. But I do want to just set up those articles that I gave you. So part 3 is about the patient-professional relationship. Informed consent, the autonomy of a person to make their own decisions, to make an advance directive, to decline interventions or care, even if we believe it's something that is in their best interest, if they are competent, capable, and making that decision on their own without coercion, then we respect that decision, unless it's contrary to our own values. So we would not necessarily participate. We may have to transfer the patient somewhere else. If they wanted intervention or procedure or withdrawal of treatment that we believe is morally required, we don't participate. We can arrange for them to be somewhere where that would happen. One of the directives is Directive 36. And the articles that I gave you, you can read through at your leisure. So this is what happens in sexual assault. Sexual assault happens to men and women. Obviously, only women are subject to pregnancy as a result of sexual assault. And so you start with the humane care of the victim. Their physical health, their psychological health, they're in great distress. They've been a victim of a crime. It's profoundly upsetting to them. They need that human care, compassion for the trauma that they have suffered. You help with evidence collection if there is a legal case to be made, because it's a sensitive thing, but that evidence has to be gathered then. And so there are specially trained nurses, sustained nurses, sexual assault nurse examiners, who will assist with that collection of evidence and deal with the psychological trauma that the person has just experienced. And it is the Catholic moral tradition that a person who has been, a woman who has been raped, has the right, there's that word, to prevent the possibility of a pregnancy that would result. It would be a further extension of the trauma and the violence and the harm that she has experienced. What the Catholic tradition does not allow is abortion. So we cannot do anything that would harm or kill an existing pregnancy. What happens, this is where science runs into the question. The best pregnancy tests that we have don't have a lot of sensitivity. A window of 3 to 5 days. If so, back up. In 2007, there was an effort, 5, 6, and 7, an effort throughout the country to have laws passed in every state to require emergency contraception to be given to a victim of sexual assault. And it became, in Minnesota, it was passed 2007, that requires a hospital, any hospital, to administer emergency contraception when the patient requests it. What is the sanction for if you don't cooperate? It's not a fine, it's not a sanction, it is the loss of your hospital license. You would lose everything. You could no longer operate your hospital. High pressure. We were able, and actually it was someone from Centricare who kind of introduced this, we were able to introduce in the law in Minnesota the administering of a pregnancy test first. If the test is positive, given the sensitivity of that test, the woman would have, and the timing of it, she would have been pregnant before the assault occurred. So, first of all, the emergency contraception isn't going to do anything. She's not going to get pregnant as a result of this assault because she's already pregnant. So there's no need to use emergency contraception. Not every state was able to insert that. What happens is that the law is unclear about what kind of medication can you use. There are a couple of these medications, ELA-1 or ELA, ulipristal acetate, or RE486. They're chemical analogs. They're very similar to each other. And their only method of action is abortifacient. They will prevent implantation or remove an implanted embryo from the uterus. That's their only mechanism of action. There are other medications. Avril is one. Plan B is available over the counter now. That may, although the science is really unclear, the only scientific evidence we have is that there is a change in the uterine lining at times, not always, with these medications. Does it act to prevent implantation? There is no known current medical evidence that shows that that happens, merely that it's a possibility. And so the question becomes with timing, when did the assault occur? The woman has had this trauma. How clear is she about when her last period was? When this exactly happened? How long does it take to muster up the courage to report that this assault has happened, especially if it's a domestic partner who's abusive and there might be some fear involved in all of that. So we do the best we can. And the moral question then becomes, how do I proceed in the case of irresolvable doubt? It's not that we just haven't looked hard enough or didn't ask the right questions. Some of these, with the science as it is, and the testing that we have, we will never know for certain. How do we proceed? So I gave you some of those articles to read which show a variety of approaches that are out there, even in Catholic health. How much precaution should we take based on what kinds of probabilities? Possible. possibilities that we deal with. And this is an area where you will find a variety of approaches. Always trying to be compassionate to that woman, never directly intending to cause an abortion or any kind of abortifacient action, but we are limited by our knowledge to proceed with absolute certitude. So if you may remember that slide I had of Aristotle, the first paragraph of the Nicomachean Ethics, it is wisdom to expect no more, expect no more certitude than the subject matter allows. We have to do something. We have to proceed with irresolvable doubt. Those are hard. Joe?
So I'm thinking of a situation that you're talking about. That's, the situation doesn't matter right now so much as it. So, what is someone is raped or there's intercourse? I'm just right now not thinking of, generally speaking, how long, say the person is within that period of being able to get pregnant. Generally, what does science say for that, for conception to happen? 3 days, 2 days, what do I have?
Janet, you may know this better than I do from Gossamer's. It's about a week window. Depending when ovulation occurs, how long the sperm can survive in the woman's system. So it's usually a 5 to 7 day window. That pregnancy, because it takes time for the egg to move down the fallopian tube to the uterus as well.
I'm thinking that as soon as possible. I mean, the scenario where it happened, when the egg is in the right spot, the sperm is in the right spot, so whatever lasts 48 hours or whatever. And each personality is different depending on their own uterus and chemicals in their uterus and all. What is the quickest that could possibly happen of everything in life, right?
A matter of hours for the sperm and the egg to come together and for that process of fertilization to begin.
Right. So just thinking in terms of if there is this piece of contraception or this morning after pill or anything, so it could be, yeah, I mean, if you're raped and it's just been, it could be 5 hours later, conception could happen.
Right. So morning after pill and emergency contraception are terms that mean several different kinds of medications.
Yeah.
They're kind of a collective
Right.
term, and people sometimes misuse them, or they think they're talking about one and the other person's talking about something.
And I don't remember the exact medication that was used, and so I know I imagine there's, like you said.
What the church can do, and it's in Directive 36, we would permit actions or medications that would impede sperm motility, try and slow the sperm or prevent the sperm from eating the egg, or prevent ovulation if it has not already occurred, which is the whole idea behind the pill. It prevents ovulation. In this case, because there's no obligation to be open to life, to a rape, that would be permitted. So the pregnancy test only shows whether the woman is currently pregnant. There's other tests, the LH surge, you can test whether ovulation is occurring. That takes longer. Not every ER is going to have the pharmaceutical, the medications, and the techs to speedily turn that around. By the time you get those results, maybe conception would have occurred.
Right. But the first step would be to say, are you pregnant already? If you're not, or has conception happened already? If it's not, then in that, the accuracy of that, is not necessarily 100% with the technology we have right now. At least that gives us enough to start with.
Right. And there are some ethicists, theologians, philosophers who would say you cannot act in any way if there's any possibility that conception may have occurred. So you just have to, it's too late for us to act. We don't know enough to act, so we must not. Others would say, and I remember when this all came up in 2006-07, there was a study done looking back in Minnesota of the documented cases of sexual assault. In over 1,000 cases, it came to law enforcement, not a single pregnancy result.
Right.
The trauma of rape also has a physiological effect on the woman's fertility in that instance. Now, there's no guarantee of that. It's not saying it can't happen, because obviously it does. But the probability is probably smaller than it would be under normal circumstances.
That was my understanding.
So it's all part of trying to resolve what are the probabilities, what can we do, how risk averse or risk tolerant would we be when we just can't know for sure. The alternative to that, there's articles that would say, so if you're out hunting and you see a motion in the trees, you're not sure if it's another hunter or a deer, but you shoot, because, well, maybe. How much risk is it reasonable? These are hard questions.
That was very interesting.
So I'm sorry I didn't give you the handouts. We'll come back to
Maybe next time.
1, 2, and 3. So thank you. I'm over time again. Dana's so patient.
We gotta pay extra. We get more than our money's worth. We have to pay you more.
Burgers are
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you, God.
In the name of the Father, and the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. We're still in the month of October, because of Mary's intercession, difficult decisions that people face tonight. Hail Mary, full of grace, the Lord is with thee. Blessed art thou among women, and blessed is the fruit of thy womb, Jesus. Holy Mary, Mother of God, pray for